So chapter 28 is on the circulatory system and the excretory system. And so we're going to round out this kind of looking at the systems in an order, focusing first on the systems that exchange materials between the inside world and the outside world. So the excretory system is the third system. We also have already done the digestive system and the respiratory system. And really the key thing here is that the circulatory system is what links these three systems together and actually facilitates their overall functions. On the Moodle site, there are a bunch of videos that I've posted that will augment your understanding, hopefully, of this chapter. It's kind of a 2-for-1 deal. It's quite a large one. So sometimes those videos can give you a good introduction. This one is not posted there. You'll find this one in the respiratory system section of the Moodle site, but this is the excretory one. I also put in an Amoeba Sisters one as an introduction to the circulatory system. A lot of these are really useful for having a thorough understanding as you come into the lab. The lab that goes with chapter 28 is a heart dissection. You can always do that remote, but I'm also encouraging you students to come in and do that in person. The other thing to remind you about are the concept maps. And so you could choose to do a concept map on the circulatory and the excretory system together or even individually. And so those are just some reminders as we get going in this chapter 28. So like I just said, the circulatory system, really the key job of it is to facilitate exchange. And so facilitating the exchange with all of the body tissues. So it allows for the digestive system to get the nutrients to cells. It allows for the gas exchange system or your respiratory system to get the gases exchanged, the carbon dioxide and the oxygen. And it also allows for the function of the removal of waste, which is your excretory system. And so it's that filtering of the blood and excreting it as urine. The other thing that our circulatory system does is it allows for homeostasis. And so these are three key things that are maintained in a homeostatic control. And it's a circulatory system, that helps facilitate that regulation of the internal body environment. If we were to just rely on simple diffusion, I mean, we do have simple diffusion that happens throughout here, but if it was just simple diffusion, it wouldn't be enough. We're large and complex multicellular organisms, and we do need a circulatory system as an internal kind of transport system. So most humans use a circulatory system with a fluid, which is our blood, a pump, which is our heart, and blood vessels, which are our arteries, capillaries, and veins. Humans do have a closed circulatory system, and as an alternative body plan, there are open circulatory systems. As an example, a grasshopper has a partially open circulatory system where there's parts of its body that the liquid that circulates isn't confined to the vessels. And so this is, obvious for humans that blood stays in our vessels and our heart when everything's working properly. The heart is key because it pumps the blood. Like I had said, it's the pump, and the blood passes from arteries because arteries go away from the heart to capillaries at the tissue level. So either at the lungs or in the body's tissues, and then back to the heart through veins. And so I remember arteries away and veins come back to the heart. Typically, arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood, but that is not always the case. And so it is always the case that arteries go away and veins go back to the heart. If we were to focus on the design of the heart in humans, it is a 4-chambered organ. It's got 4 chambers, and a lot of the design of this, a lot of the structure of the heart really links to the function of it and a more efficient design. So the 4 chambers would be 2 atria, singular is atrium, or plural is atria. I'm terrible at using that, but I try really hard to use those words correctly. These are the receiving chambers or the catching chambers. This is where blood enters the heart. The other 2 chambers would be ventricles, and they are the pumping chambers. So they're much thicker in their musculature, and they're the real pumps in the heart. If you remember the heart had the two sides, so it had the right-hand side and the left-hand side. I'd gone through that in the respiratory system. It also has the two sides of the heart, and so it has two circuits that don't mix. It has the right-hand side of the heart, which pumps deoxygenated blood to the lungs to get oxygenated, and that is called the pulmonary circuit. So that's the right-hand side of the heart. The left-hand side of the heart is pumping the blood that comes back from the lungs. So this is oxygenated blood from the lungs to the body. And this is the left-hand side of the heart. And so that would be the systemic circuit. It goes out to your system. So we've got four chambers. We've got this idea that there's two sides of the heart, each with sort of a separate job. The other key bit of the design of our heart and this four-chambered heart is that it allows for a higher blood pressure. We have these specialized chambers of the ventricles that can pump really, really hard. And this higher blood pressure is way more efficient. It's key because we regulate our body temperature, and you need to have a more efficient circulation of that blood to keep all of your tissues at the same temperature. So we are endothermic animals, which means we regulate our internal body condition, or internal body temperature. The third component here, as we talk about the anatomy of the heart, is that there are one-way valves. We said how there are four chambers. At the exit of each chamber, there are these little one-way doors. They're valves that prevent backflow of the blood. So they encourage the blood or prevent it from they encourage the blood to go forward, or they discourage it from flowing back. So we don't want a two-way highway. We want a one-way only flow of blood. This is a much neater image of what I was trying to talk about with that little diagram where I drew it as a heart. This is the right-hand side and the left-hand side. We have our atria on top and our ventricles down below. The ventricles literally are V-shaped, and so that can help you remember that. The atria are quite thin-walled, and they are the catching. So these were the catching chambers. These were the pumping chambers. We also had the two sides of the heart. So we have the pulmonary circuit going from the right-hand side of the heart out to the lungs, and we have capillaries or capillaries, either which way you want to say it, at both ends of our two circuits. So blood comes back from the lungs, all freshly oxygenated, to the left-hand side of the heart, and then goes out in the systemic circuit to the body capillaries. And so it's freshly oxygenated at the body tissues. The oxygen is stripped from the blood, and the carbon dioxide is put back into the blood, and it comes back to that right-hand side of the heart. There is a 2-minute video that puts it together for you, shows you a little animation of the flow of blood through the heart. As we talk about it, we're going to summarize that idea, or the anatomy of a heart, with four chambers, four valves, because I said the valves were important to maintain this one-way flow of blood, and then four key vessels. So the four chambers are easy to get started with. You have your right atrium, your right ventricle, your left atrium, and your left ventricle. The four valves, each of the valves is at the exit of a chamber. So we'd have a valve here, we'd have a valve here, we'd have a valve here, and we'd have a valve here. That's the exit of each of the chambers. The other four key anatomy pieces we're going to talk about are these key vessels that are going into and out of the heart. So this is really the summary of the anatomy that we're going to focus on in the next couple of next couple slides, and also in the lab. I'm going to skip a slide there. This is a diagram of the heart. This is the anatomy of the heart that also illustrates the flow of blood through the heart. We're going to try and do a simplified version of this to break it down. So it's not just a memorization thing, but you can kind of break it down and start to paint in your own mind a picture of what's going on. So we're going to draw a very, very simplified structure of this. And if you look at this at the end of us making the note, it's going to be ugly. But the idea is that we're going to develop it piece by piece. So we're going to start by drawing a heart. And we're going to divide that heart up into the 4 chambers that it is. So we have the 4 chambers being the right atrium, the left ventricle, or sorry, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle. I can't make a mistake of my left and my right now. So that's the 4 chambers of the heart. We're going to start with the right atrium. We're going to start with blood coming from the body and into the heart. So this is going to be deoxygenated blood from the body, and it enters the catching chamber or the receiving chamber of the right atrium. When the right atrium, the vessel that comes through is the vena cava. It would be the largest vein in your body because it's returning to the heart. In this case, it's deoxygenated blood. Technically, you have an inferior vena cava from the lower part of your body and a superior vena cava from the upper part of your body, but we're just going to simplify it as vena cava, as the vessel that comes into the right atrium. From the right atrium, blood is going to flow out of the right atrium through a valve. Every time that blood leaves a chamber, there's going to be a valve. So this would be a one-way valve, a one-way doorway, if you will. It's between the atrium and the ventricle on the right-hand side of the heart. So we're going to give this a very creative name called the right AV or atrioventricular valve. You could do that as the right AV valve if you want it shorter. The other thing is that there are some fancy names for this. This is sometimes also called the tricuspid valve as a bit of a fancy name. You'll notice that on the slide that is one ahead of this one. So blood has moved from the right atrium to the right ventricle through that valve. When the right ventricle contracts, the blood is going to be forced out of the right ventricle on its way to the lungs. And so this is still deoxygenated blood. This completes the pulmonary circuit as part of our understanding of the heart anatomy. The vessel that this leaves is the pulmonary. Anything that has pulmonary has to do with the lungs. So this is the pulmonary circuit. This is the pulmonary. It's going away from the heart. So would that make it an artery or a vein? Away is an artery. This is the only artery in your body that carries deoxygenated blood. Now, I got ahead of myself because the blood was leaving a chamber. And so in the pulmonary artery, there is a valve that is of a crescent moon type shape. It's a moon type shape. So this is the pulmonary semi-lunar valve. And so we've got this idea that we've left a chamber and we have to move through one of these one-way doors. So now that we're at the lungs, the blood is going to be oxygenated. So freshly oxygenated blood is going to come back to the heart, to that receiving chamber, the left-hand side of the heart, the left atrium. When the left atrium contracts, the blood is going to be forced through a valve. And because this valve is between the atrium and the ventricle on the left-hand side, we're going to call it the left AV valve. AV for atrioventricular. This one gets the other names sometimes of the bicuspid valve or mitral valve. You might know someone who's had a mitral valve replacement. So that's the anatomy of the heart that you're talking about if it's a mitral valve. So the blood would flow through that valve, that one-way door, if you will, into the ventricle. And this is where things get messy. This is where your diagram, I mean, if you can make it neat at this point, then you're better than me. So when the left ventricle contracts, the blood is going to be forced out of the heart to the body, and everything is going to get all muddled up here. The vessel that is going out of is your aorta. It's the largest artery in your body. And again, we've got one more thing to summarize here. We were leaving a chamber of the heart. So again, there is a valve here, and this is where the diagram's totally going to get messy. This is your aortic semilunar. It's also sort of like a curvy shape, like a part of a moon, semilunar valve. So in all of this, we have the 4 chambers. We have the 4 vessels. Let me get them in order. And we have those 4 valves that I did really kind of dark and scribbly here. And those are the 12 key pieces of anatomy that we're going to focus on as we trace the flow of blood through the heart. So like I said, everything is on this diagram. It's certainly neater than the one that we just did, but sometimes breaking these down so that you can see them piece by piece can really help your understanding. It's not just a bunch of memorization. There's another image in our notes that might be useful to you as you go through this one. This slide is missing valves. So if you're going to use this image because you like it, because it's numbered and sequenced, then do be aware that the anatomy that's missing is the valves. Again, I think that the videos are really useful to kind of animate this and give you some practice hearing the anatomy and linking it together with the process of blood flowing from the atrium, the left atrium, to the through the whole heart. So the structure and function of blood, if we've done the heart as much as we're going to, we'll augment that with our lab. The blood is what we're going to talk about next. So the blood consists of blood cells in an extracellular matrix in the plasma. We talked about blood as being a connective tissue, and so we've got this idea that we have blood cells being red blood cells. I often shorten them to RBCs. Not Royal Bank of Canada, but red blood cells. The fancy name for red blood cells is erythrocytes. They're funny cells in that they have no nucleus, and the key thing about them is that they contain that hemoglobin that we talked about in our respiratory system. They are produced in the bone marrow by blood stem cells, and they're really key, as we talked about, with hemoglobin in the respiratory system. The other kind of cells that we talk about in blood would be white blood cells, and white blood cells' fancy names are leukocytes, and their key thing here is in the immune system. That's going to be the next system that we talk about, where we talk more about those white blood cells. There is also another kind of a blood cell. They're often cell fragments. They're called platelets or thrombocytes, not in our textbook, and they're really key in the clotting process. And so I added them in because they're not typically what we're talking about when we're talking about cells, but they're definitely they are a cellular component of blood, just not one of the 2 big ones, the red blood cells or the white blood cells. So the extracellular matrix is plasma, and plasma is mostly water and stuff dissolved in that water. So it contains various inorganic ions. So that would be anything not containing calcium, or sorry, not calcium, carbon, the other C word. So proteins would also be dissolved in it, nutrients, wastes, gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, and hormones. So basically all of this stuff is dissolved in water, and that's really what plasma is. It's mostly water with some things dissolved in it. I've got an image here just illustrating the different components of blood. So here we have the cellular components. So we have the erythrocytes, the red blood cells with their hemoglobin in them. We have the white blood cells, and there's a lot of different kinds of white blood cells. We'll revisit those leukocytes in the immune system. And then we also have the platelets. So platelets are not true cells, but fragments of larger cells, and their key job is in blood clotting, which is in our notes as we move forward. The extracellular component would be that plasma, and like I said, it's mostly water, but it does have stuff dissolved in it. So here's more of those non-organic elements that are dissolved in it. And then we also have the proteins, a bunch of different kinds of proteins. Again, talking about the clotting here, we'll come back to that. Defense proteins would be your antibodies, right? And then also we've got all those other things. So the nutrients and oxygen and hormones and all the other stuff that we need to keep our cells alive. There are some common disorders with blood. Several people suffer from anemia at different points in their life. So anemia can be from a variety of reasons. So you could have a low amount of hemoglobin, or a low amount of iron in your blood, or a low count of red blood cells. Generally, anemia causes fatigue because your body is just not delivering oxygen as efficiently as it needs to all of your body's tissues. Another disorder would be cancer that's related to blood cells. And so leukemia is a cancer of the leukocytes or white blood cells. And the treatment of that is often with the bone marrow transplants. There's another element of blood that's important to talk about, and we don't do the endocrine system. So anytime that there's a hormone that comes up, I like to give it a little bit of extra play because we don't really have a whole chapter devoted to studying the endocrine system. So erythropoietin, EPO, is a key thing, and it's again this connection between the two things that we're talking about today, the kidneys and the circulatory system. So this hormone that's produced by the kidneys actually regulates how many red blood cells are being produced by the bone marrow in your body. The other thing that is related to blood is blood doping. So we've heard about this. You know, obviously, drugs and any sort of steroids injected into the body can be tested easily. Blood doping is really just using your own cells in order to increase your cardiovascular efficiency. So you can artificially increase the red blood cell production by injecting this hormone erythropoietin. Other times they can take out your blood and centrifuge it and then put those red blood cells back in. There's a lot of danger to this. Obviously, you are going to have that increased ability to deliver oxygen to your tissues, but you're also going to have an increased risk of clotting. And that could lead to stroke or heart failure or even a little bit of death. So I think the most famous blood doper is probably Lance Armstrong. But that's what we're talking about here is using those red blood cells and exploiting their purpose to give people an edge with their athletics. The idea that blood clots is generally a good thing. Again, we have that closed circulatory system. We like it when the blood stays confined to our circulatory system. And so we're going to talk a wee bit here about the blood clotting mechanism. And so when a blood vessel is damaged, we have a few key things that happen. So we have platelets. Remember I said that they were kind of part of the cellular component of blood? They're going to help convert fibrinogen to fibrin. Do you remember in the digestive system we had pepsinogen becoming pepsin? It was that activation of an enzyme. It's the activation of a protein. And so platelets are this component of the blood that help turn this precursor fibrinogen into fibrin. And fibrin is really what's going to be the clot or plug the leak if you do have damage to a blood vessel. So there's really three key things that happen in the blood clotting process. There's a super cute little video if you want to watch it. It was done in Brazil, and the animation and music's, like I say, really cute. The blood clotting process in our books is kind of shortened to 3 steps. Whereas in a physiology class, you can study the clotting process for about a month. I remember going through. So we're going to streamline this. We're going to really strip it down to some basics here. We're going to talk about the blood clotting process as being, first off, we have the platelets, those little cell fragments adhere, they're sticky to the connective tissue, and the platelets are going to form a plug. The next thing that's going to happen is we're going to have this fibrinogen, this precursor, is going to be converted to the protein fibrin, and the fibrin is going to be that clot. It's going to trap more blood cells and block the loss of blood out of your blood vessels. The third thing that happens is our white blood cells, our leukocytes, are going to come in and clean up the area. We're going to focus in on our white blood cells, like I said, in the coming chapters in the immune system, but there are cells that work kind of like little Pac-Men and eat up the stuff that needs to get eaten up. They're called phagocytes, and the white blood cells do come in to clean up the area after the healing has happened. So this is enough for us to learn at this level. It's definitely a complicated and interesting process. Like I said, the video is cute to watch. This is really an illustration or a picture of what's happening and the three, like I said, key steps to this. I think I filled pages and pages of notes with all of the cofactors that are required for the biochemical process. So we're going to keep it simple with the platelets forming a plug, fibrinogen becoming fibrin, and the white blood cells cleaning up the area. The structure of blood vessels fits their function. So again, this whole theme of form and function, you've talked about the different vessels before, and we've already kind of discussed them a little bit. So a little bit of a focus on their form and the function. So blood vessels connect with all of the body's tissues to facilitate diffusion. They're really what help our bodies maintain homeostasis. So starting with the teeny tiniest, the capillaries, and those would be at your lungs or at your body tissues. They're really, really thin walls. We have a lot of diffusion happening here. They're very narrow in that they make the blood cells go in a single file sort of arrangement. All of this also has a large surface area for the function of diffusion and osmosis, that fluid exchange. Your capillaries are controlled, and you've noticed this when you're sitting in a cold room and your hands go kind of white, or the opposite when you get warm and your skin goes pink. There are sphincters. There's little control sphincters that allow capillaries either to be open or to be closed. So they're made of smooth muscles, and basically they restrict blood flow through most of the time, unless you're hot and you need to get rid of some of that heat. So usually only 5 to 10% of our capillaries are open at one time. This is an image of your capillary beds being open to circulation or closed. And like I said, if you're sitting in a cold space right now, you likely have most of your precapillary sphincters closed. They're only going to open up if you need more circulation because you're hot or you have more cellular respiration and you need more circulation and more osmosis and diffusion at the tissue level. Arteries, like I had said, always carry blood away from the heart. They are often, but not always, oxygenated blood. The exception for that is the pulmonary artery. And this idea of form and function, arteries have a high blood pressure in them, and so they have a much thicker muscular wall. When we're talking about muscle here, it's the smooth muscle. Because you want them to withstand the blood under the high pressure as it leaves the heart. The veins, in comparison to this, they carry blood toward the heart, often but not always deoxygenated blood, and the exception to that is the pulmonary vein. That's that major vessel coming back from the lungs to the heart, and so that would be oxygenated. Blood is under low pressure because it's already passed through the capillary beds and it's been stripped of all of its blood pressure. And so they don't have to have as thick a wall, so they have thinner walls. The other thing, because they don't have this pulse in them. You won't have a pulse in your veins. They don't have that pump. They don't have that high pressure. We have to prevent backflow again. And so we have more one-way valves to help blood return back to the heart. The other thing that helps these one-way valves and helps the return of blood back to the heart is a contraction of skeletal muscles. So if you move your legs and go for a walk or something, that'll encourage blood to return to the heart. This is an image of all three. So the artery, we can see a much thicker wall here. And again, that form and function is what we're talking about. The capillaries, like we talked about, they're very, very thin, good for diffusion, a lot of surface area. And the veins. So we have these one-way valves to prevent backflow, and we have a much thinner smooth muscle wall here because the blood is under a lower blood pressure in the veins. As we talk about blood pressure, it really is the force blood exerts on a vessel wall. So blood pressure is usually measured as two numbers. So if you've ever had your blood pressure taken, it's usually like 120 over 75 or something like that. What we're talking about are the high and the low pressure. So the systolic pressure is when your heart is contracting. So the heart contracts. It's usually the high number at the top, right? That's the high pressure your heart is generating. The diastolic pressure is the low pressure. It's between contractions. And so that would be the low number in the number of like 120 over 80 or whatever it is. So blood pressure, as I've already mentioned, is highest in the arteries as it's closer to the heart. It's stripped of the pressure as the blood goes out and into all those capillary beds, and it's lowest in the veins as the blood is returning back to the heart. This is an image trying to show you that the systolic pressure is the high one. It's when the everything is contracting, right? And the diastolic pressure or the diastole is when the heart is relaxed. And so this would be the low pressure here. This would be high and that would be low. And we care about those two pressures because they're an indication of the health of your heart and all of the vessels that are in your body. This is an image showing that blood pressure in the arteries here. You can see the pulse, if you will, the high and the low pressure, the systolic and the diastolic pressure. After the blood goes through the capillaries, it's stripped of that pressure and it's at a low pressure over here in the veins. The other interesting thing, I like graphs a lot. This is the velocity, so you can see that it's going faster. It goes real slow, so it can have all that diffusion happening at the capillaries, and then it speeds up again, kind of like, you know, as streams kind of join a river and the flow rate increases. High blood pressure is what we call hypertension. And so hypertension is it's a changing target. It changed in the publication of the book. Anything over 140 or over 90. So that we care about both of those numbers when we're talking about your blood pressure. And so it can be a serious cardiovascular disease. It really does illustrate the interconnection between the different systems of the body. So hypertension or high blood pressure causes the heart to work harder and can weaken the heart over time. It can have increased in plaque formation. So this is kind of that like positive feedback, which is really a bad thing in that if you have, a narrowing of your arteries, it actually increases your blood pressure and causes more tiny ruptures, which causes more hardening to, scar tissue or whatever to develop, and then again, higher blood pressure. You can also have an increase in blood clot formation or thrombosis, as they're called. Hypertension can also lead to heart attacks, strokes, or kidney failures. Here we have that interconnection of the different systems of the body. We know that our heart contracts and relaxes rhythmically. If you're not sure, just take a minute to listen right now. Your cardiac output is the amount of blood per minute, so that's the volume. The heart rate is the number of beats per minute. The other thing that's here is that one-way flow of the blood is important. This is in the lab, but the heart valves, the AV valves, but not the semilunar valves, have heartstrings. The fancy name for heartstrings is chordae tendineae. Again, that's in the lab, and you're going to be able to see them in the heart dissection. And what they do is they prevent the inversion of the valves. Sometimes if you have a defect or damage to one of your valves, you end up with a heart murmur. So that's why the heart valves are in here, is to help understand this heart murmur. Sometimes people have a heart murmur when they're younger and they can outgrow it, but usually what's causing a heart murmur is a problem with one of the heart valves, because what you can hear, if you're trained to know what it sounds like, you can hear the backflow of blood. I had someone once in the course who was a lab technician, and she's like, I can hear a heart murmur in a puppy or a kitten. She's like, I have no idea what it would sound like in a human baby. So that's what a heart murmur is. Your heart has its very own pacemaker. The pacemaker in your heart is the SA node, the sinoatrial node. It's up in the atria, or specifically the right atrium, and it really is the pacemaker in that it sets the rate of your heart's contractions. It generates an electrical signal in the atria, and that atria is then relayed to the AV node. So these ones are really, really similar, the SA node and the AV node. The AV node is between the atrium and the ventricle, and it's really what relays the signals through. It's in the video, but it's not in your book. One of my favorite words in biology, the Purkinje fibers to the ventricles. So not in the notes because it's not in the text, but it's a word I'm never going to forget. If you've ever had a stress test in the hospital, you may have had an ECG or an electrocardiogram. An EKG is sometimes another word that gets used. And really what that's doing is recording the electrical impulses in your heart. Normally, your heart rate adjusts to your body needs. You can have problems in your heart and develop abnormal rhythms. And so we have a lot of technology in the artificial pacemakers that can be implanted to keep your heart beating properly. There's a great little video here that illustrates some of the advancements in pacemakers. And also, again, they talk about the Purkinje fibers and that you have this real pacemaker, the SA node, and how the AV node is related to that. So this is really what it's talking about. So here's your pacemaker, the SA node, and then that's going to contract and activate the AV node. The AV node sends impulses through the ventricles to make the ventricles contract. So again, in these videos, it gives you that better animation of the coordination. The atria are going to contract and then the ventricles are going to contract. As we were going through the anatomy of the heart, it sounds like the right atrium contracts and the right ventricle contracts and the left atrium contracts, but it's not like that. We have this coordination of atria and ventricles contracting. A little bit more before we get into the excretory system. So heart attack is damage to the cardiac muscle itself, typically from a blocked coronary artery. So a coronary artery is on the surface of the heart and it's what feeds the heart oxygenated blood. It is not to be confused with a stroke. So often it's heart attack and stroke can have similar underlying causes, but they're very different in that heart attack is damage to the heart muscle itself, whereas stroke is damage to brain tissue. Again, it can be from a blocked artery, but this time not a coronary artery, but an artery in the head or to the brain. Atherosclerosis is the hardening of arteries and can lead to a blockage. And so this idea that you can have plaques develop and that's going to narrow the blood vessels and increase the blood pressure and reduce the blood flow. So hardening or narrowing of the arteries can look a little bit like this atherosclerosis here. This is a normal, and then this one is or more normal. This one is more occluded or narrowed. This is that idea of a heart attack. So the coronary artery itself here, that's the left coronary artery. If it's blocked, this tissue, this area of the heart is going to be deprived oxygen and is going to die. This is a heart attack. Um, and it could be because of atherosclerosis, same as a stroke can be from atherosclerosis, but a stroke is damage to brain tissue. That's going to be the end of the first of the video. We'll come back and do the excretory system.